I have been a barrister long enough to know that the truth is rarely the loudest voice in the room. More often it sits quietly in a corner, enduring the noise and waits. In all my years, I never saw that more plainly than in the autumn Marcus Calder, the Duke of Vexmoor, arrived at Ashcroft Park, and found himself watching a woman he had been told, emphatically, he must not watch at all. My name is Aldrich Peel. I had been Marcus's closest friend since we were boys at school, two misfit creatures who preferred books to horses and each other's company to the crowd. I had watched him ride to war. I had watched him come home from it, quieter, more angular, with a stillness in his eyes that was not peace but something harder. I had watched him manage his estates with the cold precision of a general who no longer trusted the ground beneath his feet. And I had watched, over the years, every attempt by well-meaning mothers and scheming uncles to press a suitable wife upon him crumble against his indifference. Marcus Calder did not want what society offered. He had never said so aloud. He simply was not moved. Lady Norwell's invitation to Ashcroft Park was a matter of family obligation, a distant connection, a widowed woman in her 80s ailing who had written Marcus a letter so dignified in its loneliness that he had handed it to me and said, "We go. Not we are invited, or I am considering. We go." And so we did, in the second week of October, when the trees along the drive had turned the color of old copper, and the sea wind reached the park from the cliffs half a mile to the east. Ashcroft Park was a fine old house, larger than it wanted to be and drafty in ways no fire fully resolved. Lady Norwell received us in the Rose drawing room, propped among cushions, sharper in her eyes than in her body. Beside her sat a young woman pouring tea. I noticed her the way one notices the steadiest thing in a shifting room. She was simply and neatly dressed in gray, her hair arranged without ornament, her hands perfectly still on the teapot. She might have been invisible to a man who had not yet learned that the quiet ones are worth watching. But I had spent 30 years watching courtrooms, and I saw her immediately, the careful composure, the slight guard in her posture, the way she smoothed herself into the background with a skill too practiced to be natural. That kind of smoothing does not come from shyness. It comes from necessity. Lady Norwell introduced her as Mrs. Cecily Marne, her companion these 4 months past. Cecily curtsied and withdrew to a chair near the window, and I watched Marcus's eyes follow her for a half-second longer than was strictly polite, and then look away. It was already beginning, though neither of them would have said so. The other guests were a collection I had met before at houses like this. Sir Horace Dunwell and his wife, a couple who had made their fortune and were spending it on consequence. Miss Adela Ketch, a niece of Lady Norwell's with a disposition toward declaration, and a retired clergyman named Mr. Foss who had the gift of saying a great deal while meaning very little. They assembled at dinner that evening, and I watched the table sort itself into its familiar politics. Who deferred to whom, who wanted what from Marcus, who was watching whom, and I settled in beside Mr. Foss and prepared to be patient. It was Mrs. Dunwell who spoke first of Cecily Marne, not to the woman herself, who was dining at the far end of the table and speaking quietly to the elderly clergyman beside her, but to me, in that particular murmur women of her class use when they want to be overheard selectively. "The companion," Mrs. Dunwell said, with the word arranged to convey a continent of information. "Lady Norwell is very fond of her. One does wonder at a house full of proper guests whether it is quite the thing." I said mildly that Lady Norwell seemed well pleased. "Lady Norwell is elderly and does not keep up." Mrs. Dunwell set down her fork. "Mrs. Marne's history, I believe, is unfortunate. There was a matter, a gentleman, it is not a comfortable story." I remarked that most honest stories were not. She looked at me as if I had failed an examination, and turned to Sir Horace, and I made a note of her and what she had said, and went back to my soup. Marcus said nothing at dinner. He rarely did, at tables he did not trust. But I had learned, decades ago, to watch his silences as closely as other men's speeches, and I could see him, twice, 3 times, direct his attention down the length of the table toward the gray-dressed woman who was making the old clergyman laugh. I poured myself more wine and thought, here we go. The following morning, I rose early to walk the grounds before the house assembled, and I found Marcus already on the cliff path. The sea was a gray-green hammered metal 100 feet below. He stood at the edge of a low stone wall looking out at it, and I came up beside him and said nothing, because Marcus did not need commentary on weather. "She was out before me," he said after a moment. I looked along the path. There was no one on it now. Mrs. Marne. She came back by the time I reached the gate. She didn't look up. He paused. She walks as if she's accustomed to being watched and dislikes it. Apparently there is a history, I said. Mrs. Dunwell was kind enough to hint at it over the fish course. Mrs. Dunwell, he said, in the precise tone he used for things he had already discarded, would not know a fact from a rumor if one were served to her alongside the entremet. I smiled and looked at the sea. She didn't say what the history was. Only that it was uncomfortable. Most true things are. We stood there a while. The wind was cold and sharp, and the gulls were arguing over something on the rocks below. Then Marcus turned and walked back toward the house, and I followed, and I thought, the Duke of Vexmoor is already paying attention. God help anyone who gets in his way. The warning came formally on the third day, delivered by Miss Adela Ketch in the library, where I had gone to find a volume on coastal law, and found instead a conference I had not been invited to. Your Grace, Miss Ketch was saying, with the earnestness of someone performing a great service, I feel it is my duty, as Lady Norwell's family, to inform you about Mrs. Marne's situation. My aunt is too fond of her to see it clearly, but we who know the family's reputation feel very strongly. About what, Miss Ketch? Marcus's voice was entirely even. About the gentleman, Captain Willoughby, who died in the spring. There was a relationship, Your Grace. An intimate, that is, a situation that she lost her footing momentarily. She was seen leaving his rooms in the early morning on more than one occasion, and then he died and there was no engagement and no explanation from Mrs. Marne. She has refused entirely to account for herself. In society's view, she is. I did not ask society's view, Marcus said. I asked what you wished to tell me. Miss Ketch blinked. I wish to inform you, Your Grace, that Mrs. Marne's character is not, that she is not a suitable person for you to attend to, in the way that you have. Has she harmed you, Miss Ketch? What? Directly, has Mrs. Marne done you a specific injury? Miss Ketch's mouth opened and then carefully shut. Well, no, but society. Thank you, Marcus said, as if she had completed a useful errand. That will be all. I watched Miss Ketch leave the library with the expression of a woman who had meant to deliver a crushing verdict and had instead been handed back an unsigned document. Marcus turned to the shelves, pulled out a volume, set it back. Then he said, without looking at me, How long have you been there? Since my duty, I admitted. He made a sound that was nearly a laugh. She refused to account for herself. To society, that is what they cannot forgive. He moved to the window. She didn't beg, she didn't explain. She walked away with what was left of her dignity, and she kept it. It does not make for a comfortable reputation, I said. No, he agreed. It makes for something rarer. He said nothing else on the subject, but that afternoon he went and found her. I did not witness it directly. What I saw was Cecily Marne standing on the terrace steps, a book under one arm and a shawl around her shoulders, and Marcus approaching from the garden with no visible purpose except to approach, and then the two of them standing together at the balustrade, not quite close, talking. Or he was talking. She was listening with the stillness of a woman, deciding whether to trust a sound she did not yet recognize. They talked for perhaps 20 minutes. He did not touch her. When Lady Norwell's bell sounded from the east wing, Cecily excused herself and Marcus watched her go. He stood there for a moment after, his hands on the stone, looking at nothing in particular, and I thought, 20 minutes and something has already shifted. He came and found me later in the evening and sat down across from me and said, Tell me what you observed about her. You watch people for a living. She is holding herself together very carefully, I said. Not because she is weak, because she has been doing it alone for some time and she has grown very good at it. There is nothing frantic in it. It is entirely composed. That's what makes it sad. What else? I thought about it. She speaks of Lady Norwell with genuine warmth, not the warmth of a person performing gratitude, the real kind, slightly surprised at itself. I would guess Lady Norwell is the only person who has been kind to her in some months without requiring something in return. Marcus was quiet for a long time. She told me, he said at last, that she enjoys the cliff path because no one else takes it in the morning. And does she know you take it? She knows now. I looked at him, Marcus. I know, he said. The guests will notice. Mrs. Dunwell has already made her assessment. Miss Ketch has made her appeal. Sir Horace follows Mrs. Dunwell in all opinions, and Mr. Foss follows Sir Horace. If you are seen to single her out, they will say. They will say, Marcus said, in the tone he had used for the entirety of his adult life when the opinions of others were being pressed upon him. What they will say. It has never been a factor I could adjust. I picked up my book. No, I said, it never has. What followed was 5 days of a particular kind of careful attention. Marcus sought her out in ways that were decorous, and to my eye, irreversible. They walked the cliff path in the mornings, not together at first, but he stopped when he encountered her, and they walked back to the gate in the same direction, and the next morning the same, until it became a thing they did together without having formally arranged it. He found her in the library in the evenings, and took a chair and read in companionable silence, and she read in companionable silence, and I would pass the open door and see 2 people who had each been alone for a long time discovering how to be alone near another person without it being loneliness. He brought her once a small collection of pressed coastal flowers from the path, not with any ceremony, simply setting them on the window ledge near her chair and saying they were from the western stretch, which had the best variety. She looked at them for a moment and then at him, and then she said carefully, "Thank you, Your Grace," in a voice that suggested she was still deciding whether gratitude was safe. He asked her at dinner one evening when chance had placed them near each other what she had studied before she married. She looked surprised, genuinely, briefly, before she composed herself again. "That is a peculiar question," she said. "You read the way people read when they were educated to take pleasure in it," he said. "Not everyone is." She considered him for a moment. "Latin," she said, "poorly, I am afraid, and poetry, rather too much poetry." "What kind?" "The kind that does not have easy endings." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said, "that kind is usually more honest." I watched Mrs. Dunwell watching them across the table, and I thought, this is not going to be permitted to resolve quietly. There will be a moment. I had been in enough courtrooms to know it. When the verdict is being written against someone, the parties who most want that verdict do not simply accept its reversal. They make one final effort. I waited, and I was not wrong to wait. The moment came on the 8th day, on a gray Thursday afternoon, when the household was gathered in the saloon because the rain had locked everyone indoors. Lady Norwell was resting. She tired easily in the afternoons, and Cecily had arranged herself near the fire with her mending, and the guests had arranged themselves in the way that assemblies without real purpose always arrange, in clusters of mutual reinforcement. It was Sir Horace who said it. I believe he was inspired by some exchange with Mrs. Dunwell at luncheon, shored up by Miss Ketch's agreement over the syllabub. He said it with the confidence of a man performing a public service, loudly enough that it could not be missed by anyone in the room, including Cecily. "I understand, Mrs. Marne, that you were acquainted with a Captain Willoughby of the Northern Regiment. Unfortunate business. I knew his uncle. The family was very clear that there had been a misunderstanding, I believe they called it, between the captain and a young woman of well." He paused for effect. "The family felt very strongly that the young woman in question was responsible for placing the captain in a position of—" Cecily had gone very still. Her hands had stopped moving. She kept her eyes on her work and said nothing. "Well," Sir Horace said again, "one understands why you are discreet, Mrs. Marne. It speaks well of you that you do not air it further, but I do think those who have been affected by a person's history have a right to—" "Sir Horace—" Marcus had been standing at the window. He turned. He used the voice he had used to command men in the field, not loud, but absolutely final, the kind of voice that emptied a room of noise the way a stone empties a pond. Sir Horace stopped. "Captain Willoughby," Marcus said, crossing the room, "died in the spring. I knew him slightly through service connections. He was not a man of especial integrity. He was, I believe, a man who made promises he did not intend to keep, and who relied on the discretion of women to protect him from the consequences of his conduct." He stopped in the middle of the room. "I would be interested to hear, Sir Horace, on what basis you are presenting his family's account of events, as if it were established fact." Sir Horace opened his mouth. The family was very, that is, they made clear. "They made clear what they wished to be believed," Marcus said, "which is not the same thing. I repeat, what is your basis for it?" The room was entirely silent. Mrs. Dunwell's cup had stopped halfway to her saucer. Miss Ketch was looking at her hands. "Mrs. Marne," Marcus said, and now he was looking at her directly, has never offered her account of what occurred between herself and Captain Willoughby. I believe I know why." His voice was even deliberate. "She chose to say nothing rather than harm the name of a man who was already dead. That is not the action of a woman who has something to hide. It is the action of a woman who has a great deal of character and who has been badly served by a world that mistook her silence for guilt." Cecily had looked up. Her eyes were bright, not with tears precisely, but with the specific brightness of a person receiving something they had stopped expecting. "I would ask," Marcus said to the assembled room in a tone that made asking sound remarkably like requiring, "that we treat this matter as concluded. Mrs. Marne's history is her own. It is not a subject for this drawing-room or any other." He walked back to the window. The room remained silent for a long, crystalline moment, and then Mr. Foss said something about the weather, and conversation resumed in the cautious way conversations resume after a structure has been altered, and no one is yet certain of the new architecture. I looked at Cecily Marne. She had lowered her eyes to her work again, and her hands had started moving. But there was something different in her posture, infinitesimally different, the difference between a person carrying a great weight alone and a person who has just felt another hand take hold of the other end of it. I slipped out into the corridor before dinner and leaned against the wall and looked at the ceiling, and I thought, I have known Marcus Calder for 30 years, and he does not do the easy thing. He does the true thing, every time without fail the true thing. He found her after dinner, in the corridor near the east wing stairs, as she was carrying Lady Norwell's evening tray up. He stopped her, not by reaching out, not by touching her, but simply by standing in her path with the particular quality of presence that he had, which made standing aside feel like a choice and staying feel like its own kind of decision. She looked at him. The tray was steady in her hands. "You didn't have to do that," she said. It was quiet, and it cost her something to say it. "Yes, I did," he said. "You should not have had to endure it for a single day, let alone a year." She was silent a moment. "You cannot know what occurred between." "I know what I can see," he said. "I know a woman who has been falsely measured and who carried it without begging for mercy. I know that. The particulars are yours to keep if you want them." He paused. "Do you want to keep them?" Another silence, longer, of the kind that contains a life's worth of habit that the person is deciding whether to set down. "He was ill," she said at last, low. "Captain Willoughby, in the spring before he died. He was very ill and he was frightened and he had no one. His family they were not warm. I sat with him because someone had to, and it went on for some weeks, and he was grateful, and he said things in gratitude that a sick man ought not to have said, and I was not as careful as I should have been about appearances. Because I did not think it mattered, against a man who needed tending to." She drew a breath. "When he died, his family needed someone to explain why he had died in the rooms of a young widow instead of in his proper lodgings, and I was the explanation they chose." She said it without self-pity. Simply, the way a person states an account they have been carrying alone long enough that it has lost its sharpest edges. "You held his hand," Marcus said quietly, "at the end." "Yes." "And you refused to say so, because it would have implied more." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. The corridor was very still. Somewhere above them, a door opened and closed, and footsteps crossed a floor, and then silence came back. "Cecily," he said. He had not used her given name before. It sat in the air between them with the weight of something deliberate. "I would like to call tomorrow in the morning and speak with you properly, not in the corridor, in the garden or wherever you choose, if you are willing." She looked at him for a long moment, the bright-eyed look I had seen in the drawing room, the look of a person receiving something unexpected. Her grip on the tray had not shifted by a fraction. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." She carried the tray upstairs, and he stood in the corridor, and I, who had come looking for him with some remark about the evening and had stopped at the far end of the hall, turned quietly around and went back to the library, because some moments are not improved by witnesses, and some stories are already telling themselves. He called on her in the morning in the walled garden at the east end of the house, where the summer roses had gone past and the beds were cut back to their careful winter shapes. I watched from the library window. I am a barrister. Observation is not nosiness, it is practice, and I saw them for a while simply walking along the paths, talking with the ease of people who had been building toward this conversation for 9 days and had finally arrived at it. I could not hear them through the glass. I did not need to. At one point she stopped walking and turned to him, and she said something, and he listened. And then he spoke, and she looked away across the garden for a moment, that bright, effortful composure. And then she nodded once with the decisive quality of a woman who has decided to trust what she is being offered. He offered her his arm, and she took it, and they walked on. I went back to my book, and I was not unhappy. There is a thing I have tried to explain to clients, over the years, who come to me holding their reputations in pieces and asking if I can restore them. I tell them, the truth does not need restoration. The truth needs only a clear surface to settle on. It has been sitting in the water the whole time, underneath the silt that was piled on top of it. What you are waiting for is the moment someone stirs the water with enough force to let it rise. For Cecily Marne, Marcus Calder was that force. Not because he was a duke, not because he had rank or reach or consequence, though he had all of these. Because he was a man who had been to war and come back knowing that the world is composed of people doing their best in intolerable circumstances, and that the least dignified response to that knowledge is to let a crowd tell you who deserves mercy. He spoke to Lady Norwell the following day. I don't know what was said in that conversation, but I know Lady Norwell was smiling when I next saw her. A smile of the particular warmth of a woman who has quietly wanted something for a long time and is watching it arrive. The other guests departed over the next 2 days, as guests do when the weather improves and the entertainment has concluded. Mrs. Dunwell offered Cecily Marne a small, tight smile on her way out that managed to be neither an apology nor an acknowledgement and achieved nothing at all. Miss Ketch was civil and brief. Sir Horace found things to look at on the ceiling. Marcus stood in the entry hall and said goodbye to all of them with the perfect courtesy of a man who does not require them to be other than what they are. When the last carriage had gone down the drive, the house settled around us like a sigh. Marcus and I stayed another week at Lady Norwell's insistence, and in that week I watched a thing happen that I had not thought I would see in my lifetime. The Duke of Vexmoor become easy. Not relaxed in the soft sense, Marcus was never soft, but easy in the sense of a mechanism that has been running against friction, finding, suddenly, that the friction is gone. He sat with Cecily in the evenings and talked without guarding himself. He walked the cliff path in the mornings, and she walked it with him, and they would come back flushed with the wind and bring in leaves caught on their coats, and argue amiably about which poets had the more honest endings. He laughed properly, not the controlled sound he used in company, but the real thing with his whole face in it, twice that I witnessed, and I suspect more times when I was not there to count. Cecily Marne, for her part, uncoiled. That is the word for it. The careful composure did not disappear. I suspected it never entirely would, that it had been built into her by too many months of necessity, but it became, by degrees, something she wore because she chose to, not because she needed it. She spoke more freely. She disagreed with Marcus without that half-second of calculation that had preceded every remark before, just disagreed cleanly, and he listened, and they went on. She had opinions about history and landscape and the inadequacy of poetry to account for autumn, and she delivered them as if she had been saving them up in a room she had not expected to be able to open, and was now moving freely through. On the last evening we sat in the library, all 4 of us, Marcus and Cecily and Lady Norwell and I, while the fire burned down and the wind worked at the windows, and Lady Norwell fell asleep in her chair in the particular decisive way of the very old, and the 3 of us kept talking very quietly, so as not to wake her. At one point there was a silence, the comfortable kind, with no obligation in it, and Marcus said, to no one in particular, "The cliff path is worse in winter." "I know," Cecily said. "I've managed it." "I imagine you have." He looked at the fire. "I would like to know, eventually, how many things you have managed alone that you shouldn't have had to." She was quiet for a moment. It would be a long list. "Good," he said. "I have time." I looked at the ceiling and at the sleeping Lady Norwell and at the fire and thought, this is what the truth looks like when it rises. Not triumphant, not announced. Simply present in a warm room in the company of people who have stopped pretending it is somewhere else. He offered his formal intentions to Lady Norwell over breakfast the following morning, and Lady Norwell received them with the serenity of a woman who had seen it coming from week 1, and had simply been waiting for everyone else to catch up. "I have been watching you watch that girl since the afternoon you arrived," she told him, with the directness of the very old. "I wondered how long it would take you." "Too long," he said, without embarrassment. "Yes," she agreed. Rather, but then most important things take too long. She picked up her cup. She is the best person I have known in many years. I will not say you deserve her because no one deserves another person, but I will say I am very glad it is you. We left Ashcroft Park on a Tuesday, in a clearing morning, the sea glittering at the edge of sight. Marcus rode alongside the carriage for a while, for no practical reason except that the morning wanted it. And when he came inside and sat down, I said, without looking up from my book, "You have the expression of a man who intends to come back soon." "Next week," he said. I turned a page. "I'll clear my calendar." He looked out the window. "Aldrich." "Yes. I should have done this years ago, found someone worth this." He gestured vaguely at nothing the carriage contained, but everything it was carrying. I had forgotten there was a this. I closed my book. I looked at him, my friend, the most unbending man I had ever known, sitting with his arms folded and his jaw set, and the softest thing in his eyes he had ever allowed anyone to see. "You didn't forget," I said. "You were waiting for it to be real." He looked at me, he almost smiled. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly it." She became the Duchess of Vexmoor the following spring, in a small ceremony at Ashcroft Park, with Lady Norwell in the first chair and the cliff wind in the apple trees, and a congregation that was not large but was entirely, absolutely present. When Marcus took her hand at the altar, he held it with the particular quality of a man who has found, after a long survey of the world, the one thing he has no intention of releasing. And Cecily, who had carried her history alone through a year of other people's verdicts and come through with her dignity unbroken, looked at him with the bright, unhidden eyes of a woman who has stopped waiting to be believed and found, instead, a man who never needed her to explain herself in the first place. I stood at the back of the chapel and thought of a thing my father used to say, that the truth does not ask for permission. It simply outlasts the lies that were built on top of it. In the case of Cecily Marne, it took a duke standing in a drawing room on a gray Thursday afternoon to give it room to rise. But it had been there the whole time, waiting in the water, patient and undefeated, for the moment someone finally chose to trust it. And Marcus Calder, the war duke, the most feared man in 3 counties, who had gone to war and come back harder and quieter and more uncompromising than ever, chose it. Without hesitation, without condition, without a single thought for what the Dunwells of the world might say. That, I have always thought, is what it means to be truly powerful. Not the rank, not the title, not the consequence. The willingness, when the truth is standing quiet in the corner, to cross the room and say its name.